recorded, and now, all right, yeah, no ambiguity there. Now at the leisure of the Prime Minister.
For POIs, you guys can raise like a thing so I can see you because I'm not looking at the chat. You can also say point if I like don't see you, that's fine, but don't harass me during my speech. Okay. 1 second. It's most important for nascent democracies to be able to be free from the types of dynasties that often end up happening in these places, because any kind of short-term benefit that you get in terms of stability is A, largely mitigated under our side, but B, something that isn't worth it when you end up in terms of like being unable to make certain groups represented, being unable to make important compromises, being likely to set up corrupt systems of government that people never have faith in. It's unclear why democracy would succeed in the long term in their world. They probably have the largest risk of returning to like authoritarian or military rule in their world. I'm going to briefly model this round, but I think that it's not too complicated. Then a characterization of emerging democracies, then an argument on pre-election and during election cycles, and then lastly on what happens in government. So on the model, we think that you're probably going to try to like probably also fund alternative political groups. Like if you're going to break up major political parties, if that's your incentive, there's probably also reasoning to make sure that they can, like, I don't know, other parties can afford to succeed. But this probably looks like courts mandating that if you like win back-to-back like election cycles, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 in a row, then you have to split off a part of your party, and probably also check for things like familial lines to make sure that they're not like ensuring large political dynasties down the line. If there's any clarifications on that, I can take them. If not, is that a clarification? Sure, go.
So would you forcibly break up parties that are not necessarily dominant at the federal level, but are dominant at their regional or provincial level? So the Marcoses or the Aquinos and the parties they represent in the Philippines, for example.
So I think if there's like consistent heavy dominance at a local level, we probably do that as well. The bar might be just a little bit higher, but like we're happy to support that too. Okay, on the characterization of emerging democracies, these often exist after some form of government overthrow. Sometimes they're like post-colonial and they just exited colonial rule, or they are like recovering from a conflict. Those governments that form usually have massive amounts of power because they saved the people from that prior regime. They were the revolutionaries, like in South Africa with the ANC, where they ended apartheid. You're very likely to have like disproportionate trust in those groups. And I think it's also true on a local level. Like you can have like individual groups that you associate with a certain local politician who played a big role in like protecting your community, and you probably have like large amounts of loyalty to them. This means that you're hugely susceptible to corruption from these governments and erosion of the things that are making democracy effective, right? So maybe that appeases people in the short term, but down the line, we think that like erodes faith in democracy. This means that you get people who control policy in ways that favor them. In the nascent stages of the democracy, this is most important because you allow them to do things like set up electoral districts, gerrymander communities in ways that will benefit them into the future, which means that any kind of mitigation of of improving democracy down the line that they can propose is not going to be effective. So first, on what happens during the election. So I think that competition is incredibly important, right? Because you're more likely to be able to campaign on things like policy instead of opting for lazier ways of solidifying support, like, for example, narratives of ethnic superiority that they probably relied on in past because like they freed that ethnic group from oppression, or they are just catering to the dominant ethnic group. These are things that you do when you don't have to work against other political parties to actually gather the vote. This means that there's improved access to information. We're not saying that there's going to be like perfect, only exclusively campaigning on policy, but there's probably an important margin at which like you can actually hear what a political party is standing on politically, which means that people are more likely to vote and vote in ways that reflect their actual views. But I think that also politicians have to gather support more actively, so you can't rely on like a single voting group, a single ethnic group, or a single narrative. You have to probably go to different communities and campaign in order to hedge your bets. That is resource heavy, so you probably don't do it in a world where you don't have competition from other political parties. But if there are political parties who are dominant broken up, and you now do have to compete, that's probably likely. I think you also need to differentiate yourself from more than one party, which means that meaningful policy distinctions get made, so you have less arbitrary partisanship, like one party being the party that supports COVID control and one party therefore having to support opening the economy. These are arbitrary divides that also, as I'll mention later on, lead to worse policy being made, because you have things that are arbitrarily partisan in a binary system where you have like one dominant party and one challenger. But I think that that also means that that dominant party is never challenged in terms of trying to put forward better policy, right? So not only do you have meaningless policy distinctions when there's like two parties, but when there's one heavily dominant party, they're never held accountable. But I think you also get more views represented, right? Because even in the worst case where you break up a major party that's, say, like relatively capitalist and pro the majority ethnic group, and you break them up into two like relatively similar parties, they split the vote. So that makes it easier for more socialist and multi-ethnic parties to spring up because they have a greater capacity to now compete. You don't need to win the election for this to be an impact. You just need to go from being entirely irrelevant in like a binary system to being an option that goes to debates, gets some amount of campaign platform, and makes people feel somewhat represented so they don't feel like their government is entirely marginalizing this particular ethnic group, and therefore that ethnic group has to do things like take out arms against the government. But so we think that this is most important for ensuring trust in democracy, for ensuring effective democracy. But what happens in government? I think that you are more likely to be able to get short-term policy instability on our side, actually, because, for example, coalitions are more likely to form because majority governments are less likely, right? So this means that you represent more views, and we can trade off some slower policy if that means that there are good outcomes, right? Notably, we think there's probably going to be shifts in who's in power, so there is some incentive to do some things in the short term, right? Because there are short-term political incentives of a 4-year term, but we think that especially if there's this threat of competition, but we think that it's good that you're not immediately making certain decisions. For example, especially when it comes to corruption, right? Because corruption is a lot harder when you can't just bribe a few politicians, when it's harder for you to rig an election with like your political party that's been dominant forever. I think it's also harder to like put a single person's social network or family in power and do nepotism, right? Because there's opposing nepotistic interests. So this means you're less likely to get investment into your state utilities company if it's not, or you're more likely to get investment in your state utilities company if it's not run by the son of the prime minister, because other actors internationally also see that as more stable. I think changing parties also, there is an incentive to enact short-term policy, but there isn't an ability to like just be super corrupt or put forward policy that isn't well thought out or marginalizes a particular ethnic group, because there is some amount of competition. These parties won't be broken up immediately, right? But this means there's an incentive to pass policy in the short term and maintain hold of government. So we still get some of their benefits, right? Because there's probably like a few years of some amount of dominance before you become like super dominant and they break you up. So we think it's a good balance between accessing like competition, being able to make coalitions, not exclude minority groups, but also being able to enact important policy. Like we think that if they're going to characterize like not being able to respond to things like COVID in time, that's not particularly likely. We're also less likely to get long-term stagnation, where we enable more marginalized people to have their voices heard, and you get less corruption into the future, more trust in democracy we're proud to propose.
Here. Now I call upon the leader of opposition.
Can I be heard and seen?
Yes.
Okay. Essentially, what the opening government wanted to tell us today is that nascent democracies do not work because there are just these dominant parties that do not have good policies, that try to monopolize politics by making sure that nobody can compete with them. How they're going to fix this is just by like increasing competition, making sure that it is a like super diverse democracy, split votes in the major parties, and everything will be fixed. This is not going to happen. This might work if we break up the Democrats in the US and then we get like AOC as a viable candidate instead of like always having the moderates. But this is never going to work, and is actually going to be ruinous for emerging democracies, because all of their impacts is contingent on the breakup actually working and there being no significant negative reaction to this breakup happening, which is not going to be the case. So what is the opening opposition case today? We are first going to tell you what these emergent parties in these emergent democracies look like, why there is going to be a severe negative reaction to the courts attempting to do this, and third of all, why this is particularly bad for the legitimacy of the courts and the legitimacy of these democracies in the long run. First of all, let me tell you what these dominant parties in emerging democracies actually look like. First of all, there's actually going to be some level of effective governance in order for these parties to actually become dominant in these emerging democracies. Because if there is no effective governance, often these emerging democracies rising out of civil unrest and disorder and sectarian violence or even colonialism would never become the emerging democracy it is today. Because if there is no effective governance from that dominant party, it would just descend right back into that chaos. So given that this government is effective in its governance, all of the problematic things that the OG wanted to tell us probably does not exist, at least in the eyes of the people, right? There might be some radical, like young activists who think that these corruption issues and the dominance of the party is a problem, but for the average person who has seen that the government has helped them out of the chaos that they were once in, it is probably unlikely that they see this government as problematic. Even the ones, even if the government is known to be problematic, the government probably has a unique advantage in the eyes of the people that safeguards their popularity. This might be things like the OG talked about, like the government being the legit post-colonial hero that has saved the people from colonial rule. They might have a strong connection to locality. For example, in local political parties where a dominant political party is just representing the ethnic or religious majority, which means that they are like very dominant because they are closely tied to the needs of the people, or the government is very good at development and has raised the people out of poverty, or is very good at weaponizing nationalism. So there must be something that the government is extremely good at to remain dominant for so long. Yes, they may also rely on things like corruption and propaganda, but they probably are not rotten to the core, because given that emerging democracies are in such a precarious position in the first place, if they were actually rotten to the core, they probably wouldn't have lasted this long in the first place. So given that this is the characterization, we then want to tell you that breaking up these parties in themselves is going to cause more instability, which is bad for these emerging democracies, because what they want to do at the moment is probably ensuring that the country doesn't descend back into sectarian violence and does have time to economically develop, rather than ensuring that there is multiple voices in the political sphere and like allowing people to more effectively oppose the dominant political party, which the opposition didn't really provide us with any meaningful impacts as to why that is the most important thing for specifically emerging democracies. Next, we are going to tell you, even if these parties are actually really bad, breaking them up would become worse. Because as we already characterized to you, people love those parties, and that is why in those democracies, they continuously vote for those parties for like 10, 20, 30 years, right? Given that those people like those parties, breaking up those parties would cause several things. Breaking up those parties would look like things like there is change in the leadership, so that the hero that they look up to will no longer be there. There is shift in the legislature, which causes more instability and disruption. And perhaps because the dominant party has connections in the media, has connections to all swaths of society, they would likely monopolize or like utilize those channels to criticize the decision by the courts and rile up their supporter base who already supports them, in order to make sure that those supporters are angry on their behalf and think that this decision by the courts is illegitimate. What would this result in? This would result in people being incredibly angry at the courts for their decisions, and result in actions taken against this democracy that is very precarious and weak in the first place. What does this look like? This looks like lower voter participation, like for example in Afghanistan, where voter participation is like 5 to 10%, and that would cause things like in places where there is sectarian ethnic violence, for that to re-emerge, and maybe even for people to turn to alternative means to democracy to ensure that their personal rights are being represented, for example, arming militant groups, etc. And it's certainly what we do not want in these emerging democracies that are already in very precarious positions. I'll take one from OG.
if the dominant party is as effective as you claim, then when the election happens, people will not turn out in 5%. They will turn out in huge amounts to vote and actually be engaged in democracy because they have a reason to ensure this party gets power because there's a genuine challenge to this party's ability to do that.
The problem here is you've broken up the political party. You've taken away the leader that they admire. You've now delegitimized the court and the democracy in general. But moreover, that is going to be fanned by the media power of that dominant party and is likely going to result in people mistrusting the democracy. That is exactly what I've been talking about for the last 2 minutes. Thirdly, why mistrust in courts is particularly bad in emerging democracies. Breaking up the party, making people angry, would particularly result in the people thinking that the court's decision is illegitimate. And because in emerging democracies, the pillar of democracy of the courts as independent from other pillars of the democracy has not been established yet, and the legitimacy of the court is not as trusted as in fully developed democracies, people mistrusting the court is particularly bad because then the court is unable to play its actual function in these emerging democracies. That is things like making sure elections are free and fair and ruling if there has been things like explicit corruption. So for example, in Guyana, the courts recently intervened to get rid of Ranger, which is an actual good use of the courts, which is prevented by the fact that people now mistrust the court on the government side of things. So in the end, we think that because these parties are incredibly popular, they must be doing something right. And even if they are not doing things right, but people just perceive that they are doing things right, getting people angry and mistrustful in democracy is not worth it. Very proud to oppose.
Hear, hear. I now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, sorry, that's muted. Okay, so the opening up case is just a little bit absurd because if your response to the party you love no longer being able to get into power, your response is not to now have nobody represent you and not turn out to vote whatsoever. But your response is probably to have grassroots activism for a similar candidate who is going to represent the ideals that you want. Your response is probably to vote for the faction of the party that can still remain in government, and your response is probably to still be represented in some way, shape, or form. So I think given that, the majority of the crux of the op case probably already falls on the ground in terms of this idea that they give you on a lack of trust in the courts. I think if we're able to prove to you on OG that this is a good use of the court's time, that our end result is actually getting long-term democracy and more representation of people, then intuitively it would follow that you probably trust the courts because it ends up being a good decision. So I think that was just a corollary of the opposition case, and they have to actually prove that it's bad as a prerequisite to it. I'm going to talk about 4 things. First, I'm going to talk about why it's likely that these governments specifically can be corrupted, and therefore dealing with why it's not an effective government, clashing with the first point of OG. Second, on why we get long-term democracy and support for it. Third, on passing policy, and fourth, on representation. Okay, first, in terms of why it is very likely that this dominant party is going to be corrupt, I'd like to note a few things. So first, I think the opening gov team asserts that just because a party has been in power for a while, that it implies that it is good and that it represents people. They say, well, it's been there, it must be doing something right. This is just really fucking stupid. If you look at most democracies where a government has been in power for a while, they could just be in power due to all the reasons that Micaela lists to you, they maybe have ethnic support from people, or they are seen as a savior of a dictatorial regime that pre-existed this democracy, or people are just really complacent or not voting in large numbers, right? So if you think that the Liberal Party in Canada is actually doing good things, this is typically not the case, but rather that they've just been a pre-existing party and people are fearful of voting for third-party candidates who never went out when a dominant party is always able to supersede them. So the argumentation given on OO is just flawed in that nature. Okay, why is it then, for 5 reasons, that these parties are likely to be corrupt? The first is that in an emerging democracy specifically, you usually get to draw the electoral lines at the beginning, which means, as Micaela told you, it's very easy to gerrymander it to continue to have your support and entrench your support, which is to say that in the cases in which these governments are bad and are corrupted, as OO admits that they can be, it means that you continuously can still be corrupted into the long term. It's very hard to overdo this. The second thing is you can just put in place policies that make it really hard for any opposition or party or third candidate to exist. This looks like never having like ranked choice voting. This looks like banning outright the ability to support third-party candidates or campaign on their behalf. This looks like banning rallies, so it makes it really hard for opposition groups to even contest the existence of the government or to say that the democracy is not perfect as it stands. This looks like putting controls on the media or literally having a government-run media so that you can continue to entrench your support. This also looks like just having pre-existing bias from the fact that you were the person who saved your people from the lack of democracy in the first place, and so claiming that you are representing them and being a savior enables you to like not just be corrupt, but have a facade that you aren't being corrupt because you're seen as doing all the things OO says, like being loving towards the people, right? So for all these reasons, I've just proven to you why you have the ability to be corrupt. How does this weigh into the round? If this is true, it means that any time that op gives you a case to say that you are like doing well to people, they are A, not recognizing the fact that people just might be really ignorant to the fact that their government is corrupt and not doing the best it possibly can. And so therefore we should institute this motion because it enables people to have better forms of representation. But secondarily, it means that op has to deal with how do they get rid of corruption in a world where an emerging democracy and an emerging leader has so much power over the ways that elections are held to systematically cut out opposition groups and to systematically cut out people from being represented. Second point then on how we get a long-term form of democracy. So the first thing I would note here is that, I don't know, I think the op bench is going to be supporting democracy, but it seems unclear to me, right? Because the logical analogy of the OO case is that they don't like instability or change in leadership, so maybe they're in support of, I don't know, like a dictatorship. So first I'm going to give a brief defense of democracy and then how we get it. So why democracy is good? We think it's good because it leads to representation of people. We think it's probably good because it means that governments can't just get away with enacting bad policy because you get to vote on that policy. It means you get to vote on like how taxpayer money is distributed in a way that can benefit people. If op wants to like contest this in like OO or CO and tell me that democracy is bad, they can go ahead and take my POI later. Okay, so given that I've characterized for you why democracy is good, it means that the arguments OO gives on instability fall out of the round because any form of democracy is always going to have a change in leadership. How then do we get democracy into the long term? Because I think noting that democracy is good, the most important thing in an emerging democracy is how do you continuously get it? We note a few things. First, at the point where a dominant party is able to continuously get support, it enables that like voters to become complacent because they see this party as like continuously getting support over time. You lose hope for democracy functioning because you as the minority voice who isn't supported by the government lose hope for the fact that they will ever support you. This means that en masse, people who want to oppose the government or like a workers' party or a labor party is less likely to like rally on the streets and vote for change because they become really complacent because you see your democracy is failing you. How does that change on our side? In our world, when we break up these dominant parties, you now enable people the hope that they can be represented because it's a lot easier to get voted into power when you're not having to constantly compete with the dominant party. This means that people are more likely to turn out in large numbers. This is how we get the higher voter turnout rate that the op bench wants to talk about because now you have the actual ability to fight the dominant party that was in existence. It also means that people are willing to hold democracies accountable because they don't become complacent and they look more into the flaws that are existing within it. It's really harmful to become complacent in your democracy. It means that people are less likely to keep it from collapsing or slipping back into a pseudo-democracy because you actually want it to function, because you actually want this democracy to be good in the long term. So I've now proven to you why we get democracy in the long term, and why you don't get it to fall away. I think this means in weighing this route, if we're able to get long-term democracy, that should weigh over any short-term route to pass policy because it means we get the most people represented within the long term, and it means we keep this government from collapsing back onto like a dictatorial regime or like an authoritarian government that can just get away with passing laws that are really harmful to people. Third thing then, on how we actually pass policy, dealing with all the like stability arguments op gives. So first noting that this motion assumes you are a dominant party, which just implies that you probably pass policy to begin with, which means that it is likely that you still pass policy within the short term. I'd also say that you have an incentive to like have a positive legacy, or if your party's being broken up, you now want to just have a positive legacy for you as an individual, which implies that you're likely wanting to pass policies in the short term so you can be seen as favorable and get support as an independent candidate going into the future. In the long term, we have less stagnation in government because now you can't just fall back on party policy, but you have to fall back on your own individual policy that you're bringing to the table and forming coalitions and things like that, which means that you're more likely to just pass different types of policy in the long term and actually focus on change as opposed to focusing on stagnation and falling back on the ethnic lines. Lastly, on representation, one of the most important things in this round, because I'd weigh that minority groups being cut out by their governments passing bad policies that like systematically affect like poorer people, like not having access to like healthcare or education, or like people not be able to practice their like religious freedoms are like one of the biggest harms of having a failed government. How do we get this? We'd say when you don't have a dominant party, you're more able to fund third-party candidates because you see them as having a chance of success, so you become less complacent. This means that people are willing to do grassroots activism. It means that you're more willing to put the money into like a third-party candidate and support them in getting a success, and that's how you actually get through to representation, because that's how you fight big governments, and that's how you actually get people supported and represented within these emerging democracies. Proud to OG.
All right, you're here. Now call upon the deputy leader of opposition.
Okay, sorry, can everybody hear me?
I can hear you now.
The ideal of government is for there to be a clear separation between courts and the political process. When you involve the courts in breaking up major political parties people genuinely view to be legitimate, this is when a lot of problems arise. First, on pieces of extraneous rebuttal before going on to who actually gets long-term democracy and long-term stability, government seems to think that these things are separate. I don't think that they are. Just so first, what do they say? They say that people lose hope because they're going to consistently see one party being elected over and over again. But no, this kind of runs away from the motion, right? Because the motion talks specifically about emergent democracies. Likely when you only have emergent democracies that have had a few elections where major dominant parties have been elected over and over again in the short term, maybe over a period of 5 or 6 years, you don't have the stagnation that they talk about simply because of the term limits of the motion. Secondly, they say that, now politicians are going to campaign on policy, and this is going to be really important. But I don't understand any structural mechanisms that they give, right? Because as they assert, ethno-nationalism is incredibly popular. These populists have a lot of support in the status quo. The space that exists for these ideologies that are more sensational, that are more flamboyant, already exists. So why wouldn't the opposition party also compete on similar grounds? It seems to me illogical that the opposition party, in order to gain support, are going to campaign on policies that nobody cares about instead of sexier things like ethno-nationalism. I think this is not a point that stands in the round. Next, they say that people are still going to vote because you still want your majority party to come into office. But there's a crucial distinction here, right? If you say that people are still going to vote and that they're still going to turn out in mass amounts, and if these politicians are so popular, there are only two possible cases on their side. The first case is there are multiple small parties and you actually prevent them from being elected, by which case this motion actually occurs, right? When you are effective in breaking up these major political parties. At that moment, people are going to view this, if these parties are still so popular, but they're now unable to get elected because of the fact that they're now fractionalized, people feel disenchanted with the political progress because they feel as though all of these parties have largely the same ideology, and the ideology is the majoritarian in that society, yet that ideology is unable to be elected simply because of this artificial breakup by the interference of the court, by which you bleed into all of our impacts. But secondly, and if it is the case that there are multiple small parties, but people vote strategically and one dominates anyway, then we're not really having a debate here, right? Like if one party is always able to like supersede the others and people vote strategically and get the majoritarian elected anyway, then they shouldn't even be debating this on Gov. So I think the more likely scenario is if you have these multiple breakups and people then become disenchanted, that is when people feel as though even though they're the majority in society, they're unable to get represented anyway whatsoever. Look, their premise is that these parties already have support. And they gave you a ton of reasons for this. They themselves say that these are oftentimes post-conflict states and that these leaders are elected because, you know, like all of a sudden they arose from a degree of conflict and people tend to like these people who supposedly brought them stability. That there's a large degree of ethno-nationalism within these countries, meaning the majority race already exists. And lastly, they also say in their case that oftentimes these politicians have control over the media. These politicians can literally propagandize to their population. Given this is the case, our case is not that, these politicians are good to begin with. Our case is that, first of all, they're probably not as bad as they think, but even if they are awful, breaking these parties up and making people feel as though they're not represented, given that they have these genuine interests, whether or not it is due to propaganda or otherwise, the population is going to react in a very bad manner. I think they misunderstand the crux of their case. They cannot simultaneously claim that these leaders are populist and have a large support base, and also claim that they're going to be like, that they're unpopular by passing bad laws. I think the former is likely, given all the mechanisms that we both agree on. The alternative modeling that Viv gives you, that was never contested with, is actually just taking the same amount of political capital the courts would have and ensuring free and fair elections, right? Allowing the courts to mediate elections, but not to directly involve itself in the political process, to act as a third party by which people can genuinely believe in, because you're not, you're not like if there really is gerrymandering, and gerrymandering is so bad to the point where like people are unable to like represent their interests, I think it is likely that the courts can then mediate that process. Courts are really important for these reasons, to actually oversee that there's some sort of accountability in the electoral process, to shield the voting process, and to also just ensure that the itself is very, very streamlined. Okay, so now on the question of who actually gets longer term democracy and who gets stability, because these things I think are largely the same. Like, stability is a precondition for democracy. They cannot argue that there's going to be short-term instability, but somehow long-term democracy. First, what does Vivian tell you, right? She tells you that a lot of these leaders are actually effective. Maybe some of it is propaganda, but they cannot totally claim that leaders can become this popular without any sort of like good things they've done at all. We're saying that that is a part of what they've done, maybe not all of what they've done, but maybe a part. Secondly, given the strong propaganda, maybe a lot of people are brainwashed, right? Therefore, when courts break it up, what is going to be the reaction of these leaders? They're going to blame the courts. They're going to bypass democracy. They're going to say the whole thing is a sham. That is what they're going to do, and they're going to cause mass media reaction. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from CG.
The incentive of leaders in your world is to frame the policy that they pass as their personal successes. Like the PAP saying that you getting housing in Singapore is because of the PAP and not the Singaporean government.
But I don't understand how that changes on your side. Okay, back onto the case. Look, so people mistrust democracy when they feel as though when there's already such a great media background for people just to buy whatever the government is saying, right? They mistrust democracy, they mistrust the process. What does this lead to? It means that there's going to be lower voter turnout when people feel as though it doesn't matter even if we vote for this person that we would all like to see as president, the courts are just going to break us up after a period of time. It means disengagement from democracy. It also means once the new government comes, and this is very crucial, they're not going to comply with the new demands of the government, right? They might do things like they don't want to pay taxes. This is especially true in developing democracies because there's not a very strong legal infrastructure, and oftentimes it's really, really like nebulous what the punishment to things like not paying taxes would be. People opt out of society, meaning there's no welfare, there's no state building, and this is especially bad for minorities because they're often the ones who also get the benefit of these state-sponsored programs. It oftentimes also looks like in countries like Afghanistan, descent back into violence, militias taking over entire villages and saying, look, I just think the government is illegitimate, I think we can manage this much better, and they impose things like militaristic rule. When you weaken the ability of the central government to govern, it is not simply the case that nothing happens. It is the case that other people come in and fill the power vacuum with more violence and more infighting, and that ultimately leads to the dissolution of even a temporary democracy that can transition to a long-term stable democracy. Look, the harms of quote-unquote authoritarianism is incredibly nebulous on their side. I think that we have all the preconditions they need to actually access their long-term stable government. We provide the necessary sufficient preconditions to give these democracies a fighting chance.
All right, thanks. I now call upon the closing government member of government.
Can people hear me?
I can hear you.
What I think both top half teams have missed in this debate is that when there are consistently dominant political parties, it doesn't mean that there isn't opposition. It just means that the opposition that people feel is rarely expressed through the political system. We think that the form that opposition takes in their world, when you don't have a means of expressing it through the political system, is actually to be significantly more corrosive and significantly more devastating for democracy. That's what extension is going to be on closing government. Two extensions, rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, why do we think that society becomes significantly more unstable in their world? And secondly, how we build better civic institutions. First, let's talk about how society becomes more unstable. What do we think the incentive is for people who disagree with the dominant political party in their world? Because we often think these people do exist, often given that the majority is often established through things like ethnic lines and so on. We think there are often people who do disagree with the dominant political party, but are still dominant for the reasons that OG gives. We think that the incentive of the countries is to act in a way that is significantly more virulent and act in a way that threatens the source of democracy. Like, for example, the BJP poisoning anti-colonial legacy by saying that it was not actually a good thing, that it was oppressive to Hindus, or the Bangladeshi opposition running on a principle of Islam, saying that Bangladesh should be an Islamic state in the first place. Why do you think this happens uniquely in their world? Firstly, because you need to differentiate yourself in a way that threatens the legacy of that country. So you cannot accede to the premise of democracy, because the premise of democracy has been established by the party that you are opposing. If you are saying that you concede that, you always lose to them on the platform of elections because you are acceding to their successes. This means that people will never vote for you if you agree to the fact that the democracy that they've established is a good thing, because they're the ones who established it. They have a better track record than you. Therefore, the only way that you can appeal to them is by saying that the democracy that they established is fundamentally wrong, that it is oppressing people, that it is actually bad, that we need to tear down this democracy to begin with. This looks like people going onto the streets. It looks like having riots instead of political parties to advocate for political agenda. This is significantly more likely in their world. The second thing to say is that you have to express these things not through a political party, because there isn't any political voice, but often disaffected youth and people who aren't happy with the government will turn to things like underground organizations that are often acting in ways that are like coercive or like more terroristic to the state, because that's the way in which they get more political power. These are people who are often young and idealistic, who see themselves as fighting against an oppressive government because they themselves see that the only way to make change is through extreme means, because politics won't help them succeed to begin with. This means that the way in which democracy is threatened in their world is significantly larger. Firstly, because there are people in their world who no longer believe that democracy is a way to get their voices expressed and therefore turn to violence. This is significantly worse than anything that occurs in their world. I want to touch what they say about, like, well, you need to have some kind of authoritarianism to have stability. Firstly, the premise of this argument is that the people who will be persistently dominant in the world will have the ability to impose rule of law and common order. We think this isn't going to be the case, because often they will be facing significantly less ability. But like, the best case for them is that maybe there's internal party dissent that kind of mediates this process. This fails for a couple of reasons, because ultimately when you have internal party dissent, it still has to be premised on the same idea of respecting the legacy or focusing on the entire premise that the anti-colonial project has established. This means that it's significantly harder for anyone to still get access to the party if people are never willing to join the party to begin with, if they don't buy into that to begin with. The best case for them is that maybe there's some power vacuum in our world that makes us some instability. We don't think this is going to happen, because ultimately, when you have this kind of breakup and having elections be more persistent, the people who previously would have said that this democracy is illegitimate and we need to tear it down will now persist and will now compete in elections and have a much better chance of winning, and therefore of being in charge of the system, and therefore they don't need to tear it down to begin with. This is significantly better for democracy, which is the best case outcome that opening opposition has. That the only thing that they care about is what if there's some kind of risk of authoritarian backsliding? What if there's a civil war? This is the only impact that they go for. We say that we get it much better in our world when we can prevent democratic backsliding. Second extension then, why do we think we build better public institutions? Because I think that opening government misses the point when they make this debate entirely about political parties and what political parties do. Because in emerging democracies, every day is a fight, not against one political party, but against all of them. Because all of them are willing to take advantage of the fact that this polity is significantly underdeveloped, that it is people without civic institutions like the media, like think tanks, like free society. And we need to build those institutions ASAP if we want to have any kind of change in the long term. And political parties are never going to be the path to do this. Why do you think we get that change in our world? Firstly, because we get more, we think the status quo, consistently dominant parties have no incentive to get people engaged in politics. Because if you are engaged in politics, you are potentially going to oppose the ruling party. That means that they never have an incentive to do this. This is why, for example, in Singapore, 70% of people don't actually, they vote none of the above in the elections because they don't care, because there isn't actually any way to make them care about it. Secondly, we think that often when you have public institutions, they are often built as belonging to the party. Like it is, oh, this is the PAP's housing block. We are only getting housing because of the generosity of the PAP. This means that when you have public institutions, they are hijacked by the ruling party to say that this is being personally provided by us rather than by anyone else. This makes people feel so grateful to them and so beholden to them that they have no way of holding those people accountable to begin with. Therefore, it is much larger that people are, like in our world, people are much more willing to participate in things, like go into bureaucracy, like go into public service to begin with, because they see it as actually something that belongs to all of society rather than just belonging to the party in the first place. I'll take a PR from CO if you have one.
Because the opposition party, even when confronted with a dominant party, will always have the incentive to, to basically become as extreme as possible to differentiate themselves. So even if you break up this dominant party, the other party will also do the same thing.
Wait, but it won't be dominant anymore because it will be broken up and they'll be competing with each other. I think that opening half established this relatively well, that there will be competition. It's no longer going to be as dominant. Okay. The third thing then is that we incentivize more people to join politics to begin with, because if you see more space for dissent, if you see more space to express different views, you're significantly more likely to feel like it is worth participating in politics at a grassroots level. It is much more likely that you are willing to actually join parties and go into the politics in the first place. Whereas in their world, unless you're like a total shill for the Awami League, there's no necessity that people will even want to. This means that politics is going to be controlled by a few elites who have much more capacity to suppress dissent against them. The impact of this is very simple. Firstly, when we have better civic institutions like the media, like think tanks and so on, it is significantly easier to hold parties accountable. Whether they are the dominant party or the opposition party, it doesn't matter. We need to have the ability to have things like a free media to make sure that people understand what's happening, that we can actually hold them accountable. But secondly, when we get more people civically engaged, that's when we have a better threat against things like authoritarianism, because it makes governments significantly more wary of seizing power when they know that people can turn out on the streets to oppose them. That is, when it is much more likely that you actually know that people are willing to turn out on the streets to defend democracy, you are never going to engage with that. Opening government just blips us by saying that it's about voter turnout. We don't think voter turnout is the most important thing. We think the most important thing is building broader institutions that work not around election time, but at all other times of democracy, because that's when it is most under threat. At the times that no one is looking, that's when we need the best free institutions to help us. We prevent backsliding into civil war, and we make sure that this democratic institutions build the best in our world. We're very proud to propose.
Hear, hear. I now call upon the member of opposition.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, sweet. Give me a couple seconds. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. So unlike opening opposition, which has a rather naive characterization of how dominant parties in emerging democracies are for the most part good or have strong connections with the history or the majority ethnic group or post-colonial legacy of a country, that's a good thing. I'm just going to assume the worst case scenario, right? That many of these dominant parties aren't all that great, and frankly, that's probably the case in reality. Beyond maybe Singapore and Rwanda, most emerging democracies have dominant parties that aren't all that good. So there's that. In that light, I'm going to address firstly opening government's analysis of how naive voters can be, and then I'm going to address the closing government's analysis of how any opposition party that opposes a dominant party must necessarily become extreme, and how that analysis is rather uncomparative. Let's talk about opening government first. So they claim that having a dominant party that represents the majority ethnicity or is tied to post-colonial legacy or is somehow technocratically good, somehow lures voters into a sense of complacency. So that's nonsense, right? For a couple of reasons. The first reason is that voters generally aren't that stupid. The very reason, to the extent that you believe this narrative that dominant parties can be technocratically good or whatever, the reason why they have such popularity in the first place is because it's conditional on them continuing to provide whatever it is that they provide, be it ties to legacy, be it technocratic goodness, to the average person on the ground. And I think this is especially true because the average person on the ground, as in emerging democracies, is probably not sufficiently well off to indulge in ideology. Right, out of sheer necessity, if the majority party does not take care of, let's say, the majority ethnicity, or doesn't provide technological technocratic competence, then these individual voters are just not going to be prosperous enough to ignore all the flaws of this dominant party in emerging democracies. And that's precisely how, for example, the LDP in Japan got taken out, or how the Kuomintang party in Taiwan got defeated by the DPP. Or how, or even how now, for example, the dominant PAP party in Singapore, will lose seats over time as people realize that they're not upholding their end of the bargain. So out of sheer necessity, I don't see how OG's characterization of the average voter is somehow persuasive enough to create all the sorts of problems with the ossification of dominant parties in the long run. Because we've assumed that we're not talking about the status quo as OO talks about, right? Because if courts are that weak in the first place, they're not going to be able to prevent gerrymandering, so they're not going to be able to enforce this particular policy significantly. Even if you can successfully break out the parties, there's nothing you can do to prevent them from voting on the same way, on the same policies in parliament, or to align themselves in a unofficial or official coalition and get members of the breakaway party represented in cabinet, or for that matter, even if somehow you are able to do all of these things, you simply force one of the breakaway parties to have to align themselves with unpopular minority parties, which generally results in the collapse of coalitions and results in a loss of stability that in emerging democracies is arguably far more important economically and politically than getting marginal increases in representation, which they've not proven. Next thing, replying to CG. The reason why CG's analysis is not comparative is twofold. The first is that, sure, there is always an incentive for smaller parties attempting to attack dominant parties to be as extreme as possible because, yes, you're right, they've tied themselves to the country's legacy, so you have to oppose that legacy entirely. But unfortunately, if you break apart a dominant party into two faction parties, the other faction party has two choices. Either one, they contest the narrative that the other faction party has that is tied to the legacy of the country or the majority ethnic group. They have no choice but to contest that narrative, creating the same sort of extremism that they're talking about, or they try to out-PAP the PAP. In other words, you try to wed yourselves even more closely to the original narrative that tied the original dominant party to the country's legacy or history or what have you. Neither of these scenarios is particularly preferable, so you don't actually get any comparative advantage on your side. The next thing I want to talk about is basically about extension, right? So we've already extended by taking out OG and CG's primary material, but I want to introduce something else. So let's assume the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that these dominant parties aren't all very good, but the reason why they exist and the reason why they've maintained dominance in an emerging democracy where power struggles are common and political structures aren't all that stable is precisely because well, there are two scenarios. One in which you've got an ethnically heterogeneous society that has recently emerged from civil war, and you're trying to keep the peace between all the different ethnic groups, and you maintain power as a dominant structure by either imposing your will on all the various ethnicities or by representing everyone across the spectrum in some sort of power sharing arrangement. Or alternatively, you are strong because you're basically balancing the tensions to whichever people use to benefit from the old regime of a non-democracy versus the wishes of any emerging middle class or what have you who oppose that policy. No, thank you. So in light of these tensions, there is a need for you to have some sort of strongman party that is able to hold all of these other warring factions together. No matter how screwed up or how corrupt that strongman is, you provide a degree of stability. And that's the analysis that is missing, right? When they say, oh yes, there'll be violence as a result of the power vacuums. But what is the context that results in such a fragility that results in the power vacuum forming should that strongman fail to hold their grip on power because of the failure of coalitions I've explained to you earlier. So that need to maintain tension, to maintain a balance of power between warring factions is precisely what allows us to ensure a modicum of stability. That stability ensures that you can have consistency in government policy. That stability ensures that you are able to at least keep a modicum of political peace, even if you have to sacrifice political competition, even if you have to sacrifice some democratic norms. Because the thing with emerging democracies is not so much that the democracy part is the most important part, although admittedly it's important, is the fact that they are emerging and that the political structures need to be kept minimally stable in order for there to be even a chance of democratic reform in the future. So that's the first part. I think the second part is also related to the POI that I gave OG, which is about government, about regionally dominant parties at the local level. So if you look at democracies emerging democracies like the Philippines, for example, the risk of dismantling dominant parties, even at the regional level, is that whoever controls the federal levels of power can manipulate the courts in such a way that they can destroy the dominance of regional parties, which could have become like viable opposition to that particular dominant party at the federal level in the first place. It's the same in India, right? So when the BJP takes federal power, like what they do is that they're going to try and systematically use the courts to weaken the power of regional parties that could have, formed, local power base of resistance against the dominant regime. So to the extent that you want political competition, you're not going to get it on your side. And in any case, even if there is no political competition, we argue that there are more important narratives in emerging democracies, given the context that we have explained to you. For all those reasons, vote with closing government.
Now call upon the government whip.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just check chat. And
Sorry, give me 1 second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, showing you why we beat opening half and why that debate doesn't really go on much. Second, showing you why we beat closing opposition. Third, impacting out what we already get in the member speech. Why do we beat opening half? First, on opening government, I think the crucial ways that we already outweigh the opening government case. What are these? First, I think the opening government case is far too reliant on a worst case characterization of single dominant political parties, and is overly reliant on like the magnanimity of when we do have multiple political parties emerging, that they're really, really good. Why is this not the most likely instance, and why is our case not dependent on this? The reason why this is not the most likely instance is often because even when you have splintering of political parties that are dominant, they aren't going to start catering to the entire basis of people, often because those people, even though they are minorities and vulnerable, don't have sufficient political capital for it to be worth your while to want to deal with these individuals or cater to them. But secondly, and more importantly, political parties still have horrific vested interest in their own propagation, right? So it's always about self-serving themselves. That means at best that they have like periodical interest towards catering towards people. The monitoring, particularly in emerging democracies, isn't the best. Why is our case not contingent on this at all? The first reason it's not contingent on this is because Karthik's extension uniquely decouples the constitutionalism or the democracy from particular political parties. This means that when courts make such aggressive gestures, and the CEO has already helped us take out the awareness of like, oh, they just want to listen to the courts and challenges the fiat. Everything goes to shit in both worlds. The fact that courts are now in control means that political parties have to shift, and not only the political parties have to shift, individuals can create greater civic engagement with the state. Why is this the case, and why is this uniquely beneficial? First, this is because the notion of democracy becomes unattackable grounds, and that is the benefit that we uniquely give you, right? The idea that you can the idea that in the status quo, the way opposition festers itself is by being unconstitutional, is by operating outside the scenes of democracy, because when you buy into the democratic character, you have to concede to this. CEO attacks this and says, oh, but this is just all uncomparative. Why is this not uncomparative? First, the kind of competition you see isn't just going to be like the splinter dominant political party now turning Maoist to guerrilla. It's rather the kind of heterogeneity that already exists in dominant political parties, but is internally voiced, starts getting voiced externally. So it doesn't have to go as radical as either they're both the same and so there's no choice, or they're so extreme. The realistic picture is that the current heterogeneity in dominant political parties gets played out. But more important than that, the kinds of harms that we told you of extremist groups that do work in violent fashions is super problematic, and is more problematic than just underrepresentation from OG. Why is this? The kind of violence that we currently see when opposition manifests itself when there are single dominant political parties means that you never get that investor confidence from international actors. It means you never get that foreign direct investment because you can't be confident whether a building that you own will get blown up by a outfit, like a guerrilla oppositional outfit. This is the kind of harm that we remove rather than the wishy-washy, maybe some minorities get representation from OG. Why is this already more than their impact? It's already more than their impact because the growth of these nations will never happen internally. It requires buy-in from multiple actors, and the elimination of such violent actors when they no longer have to be anti-democratic, because to be anti-democratic isn't the same as being anti the current government, is an incredibly valuable tool. This is why when the courts took power, even in India, after like emergency in the 70s, outfits like the predecessor of the BJP, which was previously rioting and protesting, started contesting elections. Yes, they're shit, but it's so much better when they're shit through political channels rather than violent channels, which means no one has confidence to invest in the Indian market. So already I think on just how we get changes and who do we get changes for, we beat them. We had a second argument on this about civic engagement, which opposition didn't even touch. And what was this? It was the idea that we decouple the idea of like being invested in the country. It means that individuals start buying into the nature of it just being a democracy because they have more contested elections. It means that they start caring more about the civic service. It means that they have more of these watches. Reliance on the political process and political parties from the OG is why they lose and why we win it over them. Why do we think OO already loses to OG, but our case also defeats them? First, I think it is horrifically uncomparative in that the places where they're talking about such kinds of backlash taking place, I don't want to imagine what the lifestyle there for the people is. It is unclear to me why, first of all, why we can't have the fear of courts being able to do this, which they explicitly challenge. But secondly, why courts can do well when it comes to challenging gerrymandering, but can't do well when it comes to having like super dominant political parties. It is unclear what the real difference between either of them is. But finally, I think that whole argument about backlash is actually feeding the analysis that we give you, right? The backlash is felt most perniciously and in the worst forms of fashion when people don't think that they have alternative processes within the political system, or where they feel like the only way to be against the government is to also be anti-democratic because the government has a monopoly over claiming constitutionalism, over claiming civic institutions. This is the harm that we eliminate, and that takes out COO as well. How do we beat the CO case? Firstly, I think it's very repetitive of like all the material that we get from opening opposition on instability, except like this weird bit about we need strongman because we'll have really shit countries and those countries will break apart. I'm unclear why we think that these strongmen are often good in the way that they conduct this, but more importantly, we tell you that the kinds of warring factions that they mention in our world, when you decouple the democracy from the leader, are actually more likely and incentivized to challenge the strongman leader through internal mechanisms. Before I move on, opening opposition.
If you do not break up democracies, maybe a minority opposition feels angry. If you break up majority parties, you upset a disenfranchised majority who will also take to the streets and start ignoring the courts. Why is this not worse than the minorities being upset?
Yeah, I'll tell you why. Because they have to compete against each other, and the one that starts protesting on the streets will no longer have the mandate that they themselves had constructed historically. That is to say, if you were the party that created a democracy and now you become anti-democratic, that is bye-bye for you from the entire election system. And given that you have so much legitimacy of your own hanging on being democratic historically, you will continue to try to still be democratic. What else does CO then say? I think CO's best material then comes in the attacks that they make to OG and then the attacks that they try to make to us. I've already shown you why we're not uncomparative, but here's why, again, the form of broken parties is always better. Broken parties still are bought into or have to belong to the constitutional structure that they were created out of. Their world never gets that because to be constitutional is to be the dominant political party, and that is why you don't have that same behavior pattern. Ultimately, the strongman leader they suggest never happens. What we get uniquely isn't just a reliance on political parties being good, but actually an explanation for why we decouple certain parties from the nation of a democracy, therefore reducing virulent opposition parties and creating more civic engagement in crucial institutions. Incredibly proud to propose.
You're here. I now call upon the whip opposition.
Can I be heard?
You can.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to talk about three things in this debate. First, I want to talk about extremism and civic engagement, directly dealing with CG. Secondly, I want to talk about democratic outcomes. Lastly, I want to talk about abuse. I'm just going to prove to you on all three grounds why CO takes this debate quite comprehensively. Firstly, on extremism and civic engagement. Here are the arguments that we get from CG, right? The first thing that they say
which is quite laughable, right, is the idea of like trying to like decoupling. So their argument for this is that like dominant parties like the PAP hijack public institutions and they claim credit for these institutions as well as build them up over tons of years. The response that we're going to give you is quite simple, right? This is a very weak argument. Any party in any kind of democracy is always going to claim that their party is tied to like policy goals that they necessarily accomplish, right? Like the Democratic Party in the US speaks all the time about how they are the ones responsible for civil rights reform, while the Republicans do the same thing with respect to like economic goals, for example. Even on the comparative on their side of the house, we have a splintering of different political parties. Obviously, as a party which passes through policies, it means that you are going to claim credit for those institutions and you are going to tie yourself to those institutions. There's no like decoupling that happens on either side because political parties' incentives on both sides in a democracy is to make sure that you are known for certain things that you accomplish. So that's something that's a, like invested function of political parties. It's not something that's uniquely different necessarily in CG. But secondly, even if we accept that this is true, like there's some version of like nepotism or institutionalization that happens. Even if the PAP in Singapore claims responsible for strong civil institutions, why are they not allowed to do that, right? Like, especially if they are the ones who created the policy work of meeting those institutions or creating those institutions in the first place. We don't hear sufficient response from the entirety of Gov Bench in terms of like our analysis of how these parties are quite good at accomplishing and achieving stability, especially in emerging democracies. This material that Adil explicitly flagged out when he told you that some voters, for example, are willing to trade off some instances of like corruption or like weakening like democratic institutions in exchange for stability, which is something that emerging democracies actually care about far more, or voters care about far more. We got no response from this from CG, right? All they claim was, oh, it's similar to OO, but that's like lazy rebuttal for not responding to an extension. That's not an actual rebuttal. Thirdly, the irony of the CG case is that they still do not have a comparative, right? Funnily enough, they brought up two problems that they wanted to solve. A, of like extremist parties, and B, parties trying to like tying themselves to like civil institutions. But you'd notice that both those problems continue to exist even in the case of coalitions and breaking up of parties. Why is this the case? Coalitions on their side of the house are also going to be actively fighting to distinguish themselves as much as possible because multiple parties are competing for the same regional or the same federal level seat. So they are more likely to resort to the kinds of identity politics that both like government benches wanted to so desperately avoid. Next, weakening regional politics, which is something that they didn't also respond to, by the way, also means it's harder to beat them even if you split up those parties. I'll give you the analysis of how a lot of these dominant parties on a regional level already weaken the ability of those parties to win. So even if you split up the vote in those regional parties, those specific parties which already were once a splinter of like the larger party still have influence in those areas. That doesn't significantly change on CG. Next, CG also says that, the next part of their case is about incentivizing people to join politics and civic engagement. But I have a couple of responses here. One, splitting the party only crowds out other oppositional parties because they have less grounds to fight on. And this is something that we explicitly flagged out. This is because even the political parties split up into two, for example, they can collude, collude with each other in terms of fighting in areas to make sure that they don't compete directly with each other, but instead compete directly with the oppositional party. So on a whole, the dominant party still wins elections, just that they have like two of the same party like winning elections in different areas because they cater to different interest groups. Secondly, on investment, it's again laughable that they say that FDI is more likely on their side of the house. FDI is actually likelier in states which are more stable because that's when investors have confidence. When investors don't have confidence at the point in time where you're running coalitions and at the point in time where they don't know which party is going to be the power 5 years or 10 years from now. Adil told you why dominant parties are more stable because breaking up the party increases violence and actually lowers civic engagement because people don't think that this is something worth fighting for. Investment has poured into places like Thailand and Myanmar, particularly because people know or investors know that those areas are stable or that the party is going to be the same 10 to 15 years from now. That is when you get more investment, not on the side where you have coalitions. Secondly, on democratic outcomes, no thank you. I wanted the stuff that we hear, I think from both OG and CG, is that voters are like get complacent when we have a dominant party and you're likely to slip back, right? Let's analyze this on a couple of levels. Firstly, with two similar parties broken up, it actually reduces the warrant for a third or opposition party to win. Why is this the case? Again, CFR extension. The splintered two parties can strategize and collude to contest election in regional areas that they used to win back when they were one party. So the one half of UMNO in Malaysia that won votes with ethnic Malays, for example, are going to contest in those areas, while the other half of UMNO will pick the Chinese and Indian voters that they did. So you squeeze out the third oppositional parties because it's now even harder to win anyway. Secondly, on complacency, this is again a very weak argument because OG and CG just assume that voters in emerging democracies are dumb, right? Like we reject this characterization that voters don't know how to vote, right? Voters are likely to vote along stability in these areas. Because when the dominant party is poor, they're more than ready to vote them out. Look at all the examples that Adil gave you about the Kuomintang in places like Taiwan. I can give you more examples in places like Thailand, putting in elections into the constitution. Philippines, for example, like having the People's Power Movement after the Marcos regime resulted in low economic gains, for example. Malaysia breaking up the 60-year stranglehold on UMNO. These are all legitimate instances where people have voted these parties out of power if they're not truly competent. I think this goes to show just how unrealistic the OG and CG case is, because you just assume that voters are stupid and you need to do the work for them. Voters are likely and voters are reasonable, and it's okay for voters to, for example, trade off some corruption or trade off not having democratic freedom in exchange for stability if that's what those voters in those areas truly want. Given that GovBench also acknowledges that a lot of these places are emerging, therefore need stability, if people prioritize stability, we think that is something that we much rather have. I think therefore on this ground as well in terms of democratic outcomes, GovBench doesn't get the outcomes that they want because one, their outcomes are not necessarily that effective anyway, and two, the people know what outcomes they want and can choose the outcomes because we live, I think emerging democracies have a varying list of priorities. Lastly, on stuff about abuse. Parties are often constantly dominant for a certain reason, right? All broadly claims that the parties are good and that people love them, but this doesn't directly clash with OG's analysis of how dominance leads to bad outcomes. We gave you the worst case scenario. We accepted that even in the places like Myanmar or Philippines, the problem with these places are beyond the political parties themselves. They suffer from lack of development, poverty alleviation, and low educational levels, for example. Hence, we think what they actually need are precisely larger political parties which are dominant, right? We actually need those parties, ironically, because those are the parties that can provide things like stability and can provide public access to goods and services. We do need strongmen in these areas because stability is far more important than some vague democratic goal that's unlikely to manifest, even if you believe that there's something that the people want. For all of these reasons, I think CEO takes this debate.
All right, thank you, everyone. If anyone who is not on the panel could leave the room, we'll call you back in 15 minutes. Yeah, and if you're on the panel, just take a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, figure out some soft ranking, and then we'll reconvene.
Thank you.